listening to Blind Shovel, an arts and music podcast. Today I sit down with my friend and painter, Brett Flanigan. Hope you enjoy it. Brett.
Hey, I'm back.
You okay?
Yeah.
All right, so you're in your studio in LA.
So I'm in the studio in LA. Yeah.
What are you doing? Are you working on something in particular?
I'm just kind of like starting a new series. I think I'm doing a solo show in the spring.
You think?
Yeah, there's no date lockdown, but that was what was discussed.
How many solo shows you do in a year? Just one?
One. Yeah.
You're happy with that? I feel like that's what you're supposed to do.
Yeah.
That's what they say.
I'm happy with that. I think it might be nice to do one, every other year at a gallery, and then maybe do one in a different gallery the next year or something like that. I think one a year at the same gallery gets to be too many.
Well, I'm trying to imagine your life, There's parts I know, there's parts I don't. There's parts I can remember.
Uh-huh.
There's stuff I just made up, probably.
So what do you remember?
Yeah, let's kind of a fun game. Well, let me try to imagine your life, right? Well, I don't remember where you're from, but I remember that you went to school for something completely unrelated to art and somewhat science related. Is that right?
Biology.
And then you half did it, and then all the art kids pulled you back down, and then you didn't finish the degree. Is that right?
I didn't finish the graduate degree, yeah. I finished the bachelor's degree.
So you're a bachelor, you're a BS in biology.
Yep.
And then you, for a brief moment, wanted to take it to the next level, but then what happened again?
I think I took too much time off in between, and I got you
got spoiled
in
by the
art world.
Yeah.
Once you do that, you can't go back.
I guess I never thought about it.
Yeah, I mean, it was like I'd be trying to do my homework or whatever, and just be like thinking about painting, and just being like, "Wait, why am I not just doing that?"
So what was that?
I don't care about.
Yeah, why were you doing that? Why do you think you were even?
I think I don't know. When I was growing up, everyone really made it a big deal that I was like good at math and science, and so yeah. I wasn't really good at art as a kid either. I wasn't really like doing art. It wasn't a thing that was promoted to me.
Well,
so I think I got a late start on it.
Yeah, and it also seems like what you're interested in depicting visually wouldn't be a thing that people would recognize in a younger artist anyway. They would just be like, when are you going to start drawing representational things?
Yeah. Exactly.
And did you flirt with that? I feel like you did briefly. I mean, I know you did murals.
Yeah.
And with Canon Dill. Yeah. Mm-hmm. And those had deers and a kind of Pacific Northwest vibe, right?
Yeah, I feel like by the time we were doing that, I guess that was the end of my representational era, where Canon was doing the representational stuff. But yeah, I did. I guess I did some I did the deer, but it was like becoming more and more abstracted.
Were you in a band? Were you in a band in high school?
I was in a band. Oh, yeah. Right. And I do think that's, that's kind of the breeding ground for art in a way.
So
you
you
got
were
to
in a
make an album
band.
cover,
Yeah, that's right.
things like that.
You were good at math and science, which you can see in the paintings. They have a kind of, there's something there.
Yeah. I think
Now,
I still utilize this like scientific method in the paintings because it's just like really ingrained in my brain.
yeah, can you elaborate on that? I feel like we've talked about this, and it's a very it's very
It's very dry.
dry methodology,
I don't.
and you want a wet outcome.
Yeah,
Hmm.
yeah, that's true. Yeah, I mean, it's really just. I think I make a hypothesis about some sort of process that I think will make a unique outcome, and then I test it, and then I like revise it.
So give me one example, a concrete example.
Well,
What's a hypothesis that would that you would hypothetically test?
you know how people there's this thing going around where it's like, do you have this like visual memory? Like, can you make a picture in your head?
That's the thing.
Yeah, like some people can like have this like really vivid picture in their head, but I think the way I think about things, like I don't really like see a person if I think about them, but I can like I think about data about the person, like how they walk and their voice and these
So,
other things that make me recognize them. And so I think that's kind of like how I approach painting. It's like, what pattern or rule can I like play out and like utilize things like chance and kind of like picking up on these like unique outcomes and then seeing if that works. I don't really know I don't have an idea of what it's going to look like beyond like a pretty basic idea of that.
yeah. So
And then,
give me an example.
I think the best example would be like these chance paintings where I'll like make up a game to like start with like data points of like how to expand shapes and how to choose colors, and then kind of play that out and see what happens. And then I'll like take that and see what parts are interesting, and then make up a new rule and play that out, and then just kind of like see how it evolves in that way.
So is there it does. I'm seeking something maybe more literal, and maybe it's not as literal as it seems. In other words, I don't know if you know about Oulipo or the film The Five Obstructions by Lars von Trier, where there are very, very literal obstructions. So, for instance, someone in the Oulipo wrote a book without the letter E.
Yeah.
So there's like a very clear restriction, very clear boundary. So what I'm wondering is there something that literal where you're saying this is because when I hear scientific method, I'm imagining iterations, which is more design minded, honestly, where it's like,
yeah,
it's tight and then there's iterations and then something quote unquote works. It isn't clear why it works usually, but it does. And out of these five, this is what I wanted.
right. Yeah, I think I'm a little less concrete than that because I think that would create something that feels more designy, and I want it to, have like a structure, but it to be also allowed to like go outside of that structure. And I think that's where it becomes interesting. So it doesn't, the rules aren't hard. Like,
okay.
The people that you mentioned.
Yes, those
but
are
it's
very,
like
very
definitely
clear.
within the same vein, I'd say.
And why do you think you skewed towards non-representational work? Is there a philosophical implication?
I think it's just how my brain works. I think that's like what is satisfying to me. It's just like being surprised by what I make, I think. I think that's the main thing that's like led me away from representation. Although it's interesting because I'm at this point right now where I feel like I'm reintroducing it a little bit.
Mm.
Just like I'm trying to make the abstractions like exist in the world, if that makes sense.
No.
So like,
well, sure.
mainly
If you
with,
make
like,
a painting, you make it real. So
right, but I
so,
think like visually,
mm-hmm.
I think I've been like looking at a lot of paintings and trying to understand what I like in certain abstract work, and I think I realized one thing that I like is like this use of light that feels true to the world that we're in.
Mm.
And I
That's
think that's
odd,
kind
yeah.
of something that I wasn't considering as much. I think I was trying to figure out something that is odd or interesting, but I think at the end of the day, like, your brain finds something that feels true to the world to be satisfying. So,
well, I've never considered the presence of light within an abstract painting, so I'm kind of curious what you mean.
Yeah, I mean, I think abstract painting can have light.
Well, light hits the.
Yeah, so
there is that, right? But I don't like
and
getting.
I think that is part of it.
Sure, like textured strokes.
Texture strokes, how like the light moves through the oil paint, you know, and like,
mm-hmm.
you know, there's like a lot of refraction within the oil, and that's like, I think, what makes that medium so satisfying. But then I think also just within that, just kind of like pictorial light, where maybe the painting has a light source that's like understandable.
Like a cubistic sense?
Sort of, yeah.
Because cubism's really like caught between the two frames.
Right. And maybe not as literal as like a cubist painting. But yeah, I think I'm trying to reintroduce that. And in that, I'm like looking at all these old photos I've taken and trying to like understand like what makes a black and white photo interesting, and then trying to apply that to like abstract painting. So
what strikes me is that there's something odd about you in the sense of, I don't know how to word it. I mean, everyone I talk to, right, on the podcast typically feels outside of something, like not central, and like an outsider, you could say, in a simplistic sense. But what's always been interesting to me is you make work that is supposed to be, in a certain context, very intellectualized and art speaky, because it's in this history of abstraction that is typically associated with academia. But your background, and from what I recall, it's not really where you're coming from at all.
Yeah.
And, you know, like with the train hopping and the graffiti, and the lifestyle in general is not that of an academic who's being very clinical about the history of art and how abstraction could alter that path. So that's very interesting to me that ultimately you've arrived at that place, probably more via, I don't know. I guess I don't know how you arrived there in a sense, because I imagine, again, everyone around you is making very representational work.
Yeah.
And again, there's that outsider element there. And I recall you giving a speech at Athens B, and I think you were kind of uncomfortable about talking about the work. I don't know if you still feel that way, but I could understand, given that that's not where you're coming from. You're not intellectualizing the process.
I think that's evolved. You know,
yeah.
I spend a lot of time thinking about art and looking at art, and I think maybe not coming from that background, as I get older, it gives me like more of a reason to pursue that type of thinking. And like, yeah, you know, when you feel like an outsider, I think there's something where you're kind of like trying to seek out the knowledge that you may not have.
I'm not even sure you do feel that way. I don't know if you feel that sense of outsideness, but I'm not even saying it's a bad thing. I don't think intellectualizing art is a good thing. I actually think it's usually a bad thing.
Yeah. Well, yeah, I don't know. I don't know if I'm intellectualizing it that much, but I spend a lot of time around art and like, I work at art galleries and I look at art every day. So.
And what moves you?
Well, I think I realize what moves me is use of light, use of like color interactions at like a micro level and a like macro level. So like to be able to look at least this is within painting specifically, but to look at something up close and like feel satisfaction within that, and then to be able to step away from it and feel an equal satisfaction. Yeah, and then just like this idea with like the use of light. I think, yeah, because I recently asked myself this question, like what moves me? Like why do I like what I like? And those are kind of the answers I came up with.
Do you like sunsets?
Sure.
Some people don't.
Is that true? I feel like everyone has to like them.
I think some people don't. But how human?
Those people are contrarians.
Probably, but I think contrarians still feel that. You know what I mean? Mm-hmm. I know they're in a reactive state, but they still feel that reaction. Mm-hmm. How human do you feel? Because I ask this question because I feel that, I don't know, for me at least, I can be very literal minded, that my work, as I became more human, is striving for a more literal and human connection. And by that I mean, how do I put it? Maybe even like a more blue collar connection. If that makes sense. But yeah. How human do you feel?
I feel quite human. I think I don't really know how you're defining that.
I don't want to get into it too much. Well, I only ask because I feel that obviously the state of abstraction in a mental sense, I think I myself have created traps at times in my life, and they were composed of abstraction. But when my heart is most open and I return to human connection, and for instance, like I'm never going to cry from a Jackson Pollock. I'm sure there's some dweeb out there who's going to do it, but I don't believe it. No, and for me, like I get older, I almost like cry at commercials sometimes. Like if they're really well made, it's like 1 minute of hyper density of just a lifetime. The people have kids, somebody dies. I don't know what commercial this would be for, but you know what I mean? There's like this, at least I felt as I entered my 30s, there was something missing, and all I could call that is humanity. And sitting in a room drawing for me wasn't cutting it. That doesn't mean art can't do that. It just means how I was making art wasn't conducive to that growth. And so that's what I think that's what I mean, is that the human journey has certain contours and experiences that are part of it. Yeah.
Well, I wouldn't define the human journey as strictly like interactions with other people, although that is a big part of it. But yeah, I mean, sometimes I feel the same way, like, especially having a studio at home. I'm not in this like studio community anymore, and it feels like very insular. But I think part of the human journey is like your own sort of like mental journey. And I think that's why I make paintings. It's kind of like a mental health exercise, even though sometimes it's maybe the opposite.
Right. It never struck me that art was therapeutic when you did it right. It's much more complex. It's a combination of everything. It's like life. It's just there's ups, downs, there's struggles, there's breakthroughs. But it doesn't, it's never made sense to me as therapy. I mean, if you're not looking for a specific outcome, if you're not looking to progress in a sense, then I think it could be therapeutic. but the real challenge and pursuit of it is not comforting.
Yeah, but I think it's maybe not comforting, but I think that's part of my kind of like science brain is I like this idea of solving a problem. And like if I'm deep working on a painting, I can kind of like constantly be solving it, even though I'm not working on it. If I'm somewhere else, I can still kind of be like solving something. And that's satisfying to me in my human brain. So
Yeah, I mean, I think I asked that question as well because it's an increasingly relevant question as to what is human, and why does it matter if a human made art or if you fed an algorithm these abstractions and then it spat some more out. Of course, there are massive differences. I just think over time that might decrease, and then the question will be even more prescient in the sense of by a human, and what does the work have to say about that experience? Because I think machines are going to be able to make stuff that mimics it, but
yeah,
I personally don't feel that it's the same thing. But if you're a strict materialist, which I don't know if you are, I mean like an empiricist in that sense, your process to me at least implies a bit of that, that it's kind of like pushing around cue balls.
But I think I think the human element, not that can't be replicated by AI or whatever. I think the human element is in the ways that the pattern breaks down and the mistakes you make, and your individual like learning from these mistakes, or like midpoints in the process or something. Whereas I don't think you would like find these things just from like observing the finished product of a million paintings and then trying to recreate one or something, or even inputting the same parameters that I'm starting with into a computer or whatever.
Yeah.
And seeing how
I
it plays
think
out.
that's part of what I'm getting at is certainly people make work where you might say they're vulnerable and it's very obvious who they are via the work. And in that sense, I would say, oh, that's a reflection of their humanity. But, and I think all work does that, by the way, but it isn't clear when someone makes abstraction what that might tell you. Although I know you, so when I look at the work, it's kind of telling.
Yeah, well, I think what I realized recently too is that, you talk about this like background that's kind of outside of like the art world with like the trains and things like that. But I think that sort of thing is part of why I make the work I do. And it kind of all relates to each other. It's like, I think the thing I was drawn to about like riding trains is that you never really know what's going to happen. And you're just like constantly improvising. And there's like never been a plan that just like goes perfectly. And that's kind of the fun about it, even though it's also the worst part about it. But that's like the part that you remember is like you made it through and you made a decision and you like ended up in some different city, and now you're in a different city and you met this person and they're doing this, and like it's just this pathway that like it's unreplicatable. And I think that I realized that that's like what my art's about, is the same idea as like these like adventure things that I like to do. No, and I think that's why it's like both of those things are satisfying to me, where both could be like considered torture to a lot of people, like, being hot and dirty and like not knowing where you're going and out of control, I think sounds pretty terrible to a lot of people.
Do you feel that it is more difficult to preserve that type of energy as you get older, or are you still maintaining this somehow?
I think it is, but it also just changes. Like, I'm planning this motorcycle trip right now, and I feel like it's kind of the same situation, just like a little bit more older version of it, where you know, still the fun parts are like when things go wrong. But yeah, it's just kind of like an adventure that might be a bit uncomfortable.
Right. So you had that motorcycle mechanic moment.
Yeah.
Is that still going on?
Yeah. I mean, it's still going on. I think the mechanic part of it is kind of over just because I don't know. There's nothing more to fix. But yeah, I think I still like working on stuff. And I think that's like a nice counterpoint to the art practice too, is doing things like that, where there's like a correct way to do something, and if you follow all these steps, you like get the correct outcome, and that'll feel satisfying.
In that sense, do you ever make a painting that you throw out or you don't use?
Definitely.
And by what metric would you make that determination? I guess the question comes from the place of, there's this kind of, maybe it's a front, maybe it's not, of this whatever happens, happy accidents, Zen kind of thing. But ultimately, that chaos is met with a certain order at the end of the day, which is the editing process. Right. Is it clear to you why certain things get in or don't? Or is that just an intuitive process you don't even want to unfold?
Yeah, I think that's an intuitive process. And it's also, I think it's, a lot of times it's based on like a lot of external factors. Like I'm destroying and not using a lot of paintings when I don't have a hard deadline because I can. And I think the editing process gets a little softer when I have a deadline and I don't have time to be as like harsh. And I think that's usually good because, a month later I'll come around and be like, oh, this is fine. I like this. Whereas, if there's no hard deadline, I'll want it to be the best painting ever made, which is just impossible. And yeah. So then, if it's not like fully up to these impossible standards, a lot of times I'll get rid of it. So yeah, I think it's also, I'm trying to be better about giving things time and letting things breathe. I spent like the past like almost year working on ceramics and kind of like taking a break from painting. And I think that taught me a lot about, just like patience. You can't just like have a finished glazed ceramic piece tonight like you could have a painting.
Yeah. And like then the glaze
and glazing and firing and all these steps, and there's also a lot of uncertainty within each one.
Right, the glaze, it doesn't look like, when it goes on, it doesn't look the same as when it's fired. That always pissed me off immensely. Yeah. But I get the sense that we perceive things differently, and so I can understand why it would piss me off and maybe not you.
Well, yeah, I think I was really excited about it, but I think the big difference with it is it would always come out not how I expected it. And I think that I found excitement in it, but I think the difference is with painting, you can take that and then you can continue to rework it. Whereas, right. I mean, there's to a point you could still try to reglaze something, but it's not really going to be the same. It's not going to stick the same. It's not going to look the same. So
does the nature of this process make it difficult to kind of brand yourself as a fine artist?
Yeah, I think that's something I'm dealing with. I mean, I've been dealing with for a while, but I think with moving to LA, there was like a little bit of this idea that people don't really know me here. So it's a good opportunity to like take some time to step back and like figure that out. And I think working in sculpture was part of that. And I think ultimately it just like really solidified the fact that I like making paintings, and I think that that's my brand. But I think it's good to kind of step away from just kind of like producing to produce and then coming back to it with maybe some like new insight. But I think ultimately it's weird because I think my work both can feel like there's a lot of outliers.
I don't feel that way.
Yeah, I think also at the end of the day, it's like it's all within the same vein.
So. I'm just wondering from that perspective of the collector, you know.
Yeah.
I do recall that you had some good collectors who were understanding back in the day.
Yeah.
And I hope they still are.
Yeah, I think so, but I do think that, you know, that only goes so far.
Sure, they like what they like, and you like what you like. And
yeah.
I think the question comes from a place of, I don't know if this is accurate, but perhaps you don't like predictability or a certain calcification or rigidity. But with a brand or with any commercial pursuit, there often becomes that moment where the consumer needs to identify you as such, so that you can kind of build vertically and have a compounding interest when they hear the name Brett Flanigan.
Right. Yeah, that's something I'm dealing with, and I've been dealing with, but I think I've come to terms with like the fact that that's pretty necessary in, you know, if you don't want to live in the attic at the bordello, you know, you kind of got to make a brand for yourself at the end of the day. You can't just kind of like be doing your continuous experiments.
Yeah, it's tricky. It's really tricky.
Yeah. Which I think, you know, that idea has always felt a little soul sucking, but I feel like I've come to terms with it. And I think what I realized is that you just have to make sure your brand is a thing that you can still find joy in every time.
Yeah. How big is the umbrella?
Yeah.
Is the question.
Right.
And that's the difficulty of early success is it's hard to capture all of the parts of yourself you want out there.
Yeah.
Now, fortunately with your work, unless you were desiring a more representational mode, I don't feel that it's as literal, you know, so they're not going to go to you and say, I want the deer paintings. Mm-hmm. They wouldn't even know what to say. They might say, I want a green painting.
Yeah.
But that would be kind of, I'm sure those conversations happen, of course, but, or I want the one that looks like that one. But there's less of it's less of a trap in some ways. But if I'm being honest, I think there's less of a upside as well. And this could be my personal bias, but again, because I feel like the things that hit me and have altered my life aesthetically or from the art perspective are always representational. Now that's probably just me, but I also suspect that, you know, all religious books are about the human experience, depicting human gods, etc. And so there's something to be said for that, you know, like I still think that there's something more unifying about the depiction of the literal human body.
Yeah.
Not that I'm like some Renaissance painter. I mean, I personally don't even traffic in what I'm talking about, but I think there are trade-offs to those things. Like if you want an idiosyncratic expression, you often forsake the emotional impact, at least, of a more straightforward, almost like Shakespearean narrative about the human experience.
Yeah.
Does that make sense?
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, I think it's a thing that I think about of like how to kind of like take parts of that and introduce them into like the narrative of what I'm doing. But at the same time, you don't want to make something feel forced, you know, when it's not there.
Yeah, I don't think your work ever really feels forced.
That's good. That's nice to hear.
I don't know how it would.
Yeah.
I'm trying to imagine it. Trying to imagine what a stiff one.
Yeah. Well, I think it's funny because I think the last solo show I had, there was this one painting that I started kind of like a bunch of people wanted it, and it was one of the first ones that sold. And so I was like, I can make a similar one as a commission. And so I think I made like 3 or 4 similar paintings.
And what happened?
I don't think any of them were necessarily bad, but I think they got increasingly forced and stiff when I looked at like the 4th one versus the first one.
Do you think other people knew that, or that was only something you sensed?
So. I think it was only something I sensed.
I think that's the weird part is, I mean, I think the consumer can be fooled about 99% of the time, but you obviously can't fool yourself. So you can make 100 of those things and probably make more money, but slowly, maybe die is too strong of a word, but slowly automate. And I do think that is dying in some sense, right? Like if we're talking about the automation process of a computer, it has different concerns because it's not a living thing.
Yeah.
But as a human, the closer you step, no, I'm just wrong actually, because oddly enough, there's meditative processes that are repetitive and can seem automatic or robotic, but it's the opposite. So I don't know what I'm saying actually.
No, but I think that even if you can't explain it exactly, that is a thing where you're like, I think your brain just like maybe isn't getting the same workout each time you're like repeating something, and you can get atrophy.
It's true. I also think we don't know what's good for us, or we don't know what we want, and so when we become hyper conscious of an activity, we are aware of each decision, and then that creates what I would say is just like a narcissistic path that isn't connecting with other people. And you can live life like this, obviously, as well.
Yeah. Yeah, definitely.
But all right, so we got the paintings. You're dabbling in ceramics. I saw that one. You're riding motorcycles.
Riding motorcycles.
You got big pearly white teeth, very clean. You don't live in the bordello. You're ascending in comfort and lifestyle.
Yeah, which has its trade-offs too.
Sure. It's tricky.
Sometimes I wish I had that bordello rent.
There's no going back, man.
No, there's really no going back.
Just zeros getting added to the end of stuff.
Yeah.
So I forget how old you are, actually.
38 now.
Nice.
Yeah.
Is this antithetical to how you think, but can you imagine the trajectory of the next 38 years?
I mean, sure, I can imagine kind of like maybe a best case scenario or even a medium case scenario.
Nice.
But I don't think either of those will be how it goes.
Of course.
I
just think sometimes, I can imagine projects that will probably never happen based on my lifespan. And I could hope they do. And they take different forms, medium-wise. But I asked that question to understand how medium-specific someone's interests typically are. I think as you get older in your 30s, things do kind of solidify a little more. But I'm trying to understand how much you truly love the act of painting itself.
Yeah. That's a good question. I think, having spent some time away from it, I realized that it is something that I truly enjoy. But I think my life has also expanded into like more and more hobbies that I could see myself pursuing pretty strongly if I had more time. And I do feel like sometimes painting takes priority over these things because I feel some sort of like commitment to it and to this like career I've started with it. So yeah, it's hard to say like if I didn't, maybe if I didn't have like any success with it whatsoever, if I would still like be as committed to it, or if I'm just kind of partially committed to it because I feel like a commitment to, people who have bought my work and like have believed in my career or whatever.
No, I've always found that interesting. I think the two types of artists that are the most fascinating are the ones who can kind of take it or leave it any day because they kind of have this expansive life in general that art is a secretion from. And then those who have no choice and they're absolutely shackled and tortured by the activity itself and couldn't, add up 2 digits as a cashier if they had to.
Right. Yeah.
And there's something very transfixing about those two polarities.
Yeah. I think I fall somewhere in the middle of those.
Well,
yeah.
You just ruined you were supposed to pick one. No, I mean, I might as well, honestly, as I think about it. But I think about sometimes if I just lost my arms, what would I do? There's like a bunch of stuff I'd like to do, but I also really like having arms.
Yeah, but I don't know, that question, it kind of created this like excitement in me. I was like, wow, if I lost my arms, I'd probably get really into like making electronic music or something.
With what? Your feet?
With my feet or, my mouth.
Be cool to make arms.
Or, yeah. But I think, some sort of constraint, I think you'd find something pretty quickly.
I think some people do. I guess that's my point. It's like some people are just like born to draw, and if you took their arms away, they'd be like, this is the worst life of all time. Yeah. And then there's some people, I don't know, maybe more like chameleon-ish, adaptive. Yeah. And I see that you have a life outside of the art that doesn't even fall into the art in a very literal way, which I think is probably a good thing.
Yeah. I agree. I think it's also, there's, time is so limiting.
Oh, yeah.
Because, there's so many things that I would love to be doing all the time. And, you kind of just have to pick and choose. And, sometimes I think about, like, before I kind of had like resources to pursue other hobbies, I was pretty content and just like having one thing and really committing to it.
Yeah.
And the more, expansive you get in these things, then you just kind of realize you have to make the choice yourself.
Yeah, I'm very ambivalent about that because I tend to do several things at once, but as I get older, I recognize that unity is one of the most important things to pursue.
Yeah.
And that doesn't mean doing one thing. It just means that things are unified across some kind of thread. Mm-hmm. And that there is frivolity, that there is stuff that can be really fun, but also just not add to anything in the long term. Mm-hmm. And I guess that's maturity, making those decisions and just saying, well, I don't have infinite time.
Yeah.
I can't do everything.
Definitely.
But also there's just the practical side. Like, do you live off of the work at this point?
Not right now.
No?
I've gone through phases, but I think, yeah, I had a couple good years, and then you kind of level up your lifestyle, and then, yeah.
You got 2
You just can't
mopeds
keep it
now.
up. Yeah,
Yeah.
for sure. So no, I'm doing like prep work at art galleries,
What's that?
like art handling, installs,
Mm-hmm.
packing, things like that. Which is cool. I like it.
Yeah, it's not bad.
Yeah.
Yeah, it does bring to mind that interesting question of just branding one's self.
Mm-hmm.
That kind of inevitable thing that happens, I suppose, in a capitalist society. And there's those who feel really comfortable doing it and can go really, really deep into it. And then there's others who just dip a toe, just enough to be seen.
Right.
That's kind of how I feel. Like it's hard for me to care about that side of it, but it's, as you get older, it's just absolutely essential.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think there's some sort of like maturity and like understanding the sort of like corniness of that, but then also understanding why it exists. And
yeah, you mean the nature of the whole thing. Yeah. I think there's something to be said for letting people know who you are, if that makes sense. As much as I like the idea that we contain multitudes, there's a pattern to that.
Yeah.
And I do like hiding aspects of it too.
Yeah.
There's something alluring about it. But I guess, what's so funny is there's just this kind of judo flip that branding does to everything, where like you could brand that mystery, but then by virtue of branding the mystery, it becomes contained.
Yeah. And
this is a very, very difficult game to play.
Yeah.
It is a privilege to play it, of course. It's really not. So if that's the worst thing you got to handle, that's really not a bad one. But
right.
I think on the podcast, I'm often talking to people about, some people get to financial stability in very, very different ways. And some of them, everyone's going to compromise. I mean, I think that's an illusion I had when I was young, is that you're going to end up in a museum, zero compromise. It's just unadulterated. That's you. And obviously none of life really works that way. It's more about how elegantly you can do it.
Yeah.
And compromise has a negative connotation.
Yeah.
It really shouldn't. But I find that your career is very interesting in that sense, that there's these waves that, maybe you did like a Facebook mural, right?
Yeah.
So like the Bay had that natural pipeline to, if you make art long enough there, you'll probably, and you're good enough, you'll end up at a Facebook mural. Right. And then you can kind of ride that for a year or some shit.
Yeah.
And I don't know, it's just interesting. There's some archetype that you embody that I don't really know how to talk about, but obviously there's like the graffiti to mural to fine art transition, but it's not a linear thing. There's kind of a wave.
Yeah. Yeah, it's a wave.
And it very much, yeah, go ahead.
I think it's funny because, I think, when I started doing the murals, I remember very like strictly in my head being like, there's no logo in the murals. There, there's no creative control besides me and maybe Canon if we're doing something together. And then I think by the time, this like Facebook, Google tech mural kind of era came around, it was still like, I'm not painting your logo, but it was like, yeah, you can have some creative control and like choosing the colors and like giving feedback on the sketch, things like that. And I haven't done a mural in quite a while, but I had a meeting with someone the other day about something like a potential mural. And they asked that question. They were like, so how do you feel about like incorporating like our thoughts and, company things into the work? And I was just like, like that's fine. I think if you asked me that question 5 or 10 years ago, I would have answered totally differently. But
that's fascinating. So are we talking about, so within the abstraction, there's like logos?
I mean, I think I don't exactly know what they wanted. I haven't talked to them since then, but that was kind of the idea I had, where they would, maybe like, not like within the mural itself, but maybe somewhere on there, I'd like write their company name or something,
Yeah.
Make it like clear that it's an advertisement for their company in one way or another.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I mean, they're not paying you to be yourself. That was the thing I came to conclude at some point.
Yeah.
Oh, you don't get paid. You get paid to compromise in one manner or another. Whether your time, your focus, your energy, that's fair. Like, I don't know. Anything else would suggest you're just a brat if you manage to avoid that. But again, it's about how elegantly you do it.
Yeah. And it's also like I kind of stopped promoting any of these things where there is compromise, and that feels fine for everyone. So, yeah.
Yeah, it's an interesting moment when you reach those places, because you simultaneously see your former self behind you talking shit. And not to suggest that was an enlightened being. They just represent a kind of certain ethos. But you then have to have like a conversation with your former self and try to be really honest about who they were and who you are, and then how that fits in.
Yeah.
And I don't know. I mean, I try to be as honest about that as I can. But like you said, I'm curious about, did you feel slimy at all, or were you just kind of like, yeah, that's where I'm at?
I didn't feel slimy at all, because I think I've at this point separated that so much from my painting, fine art painting. And also I think separated it so much from like what graffiti was and how that led into painting murals at the beginning. And I think that ethos was very strong. And now I think just in general in the years since, like, murals aren't associated with graffiti. They're just like, they're a totally different thing. That's kind of corny, to be honest.
Right.
I think they felt exciting at a time. And that was like really short-lived.
You're saying they're categorically corny, so it's kind of like you're comfortable almost expressing that part of yourself within that frame because that's the appropriate place for it to happen.
Yeah, I think so.
It's like when there was corporate spray painting classes next to the gallery.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, that was a watershed moment.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's weird. It's like tilling a field or something. You move to the next one. You're like, well, this is where all the fresh stuff is happening. This is where the work needs to happen. But it doesn't mean I'm going to forsake the fertile soil over there in a different manner.
Yeah.
I've been too prone to just burn that field behind me and then on to the next. But there's a lack of wisdom there.
Yeah. I mean, burning kind of, can reintroduce nutrients into the soil.
That's true.
But yeah.
So you got a show coming up.
Yep. Spring, I believe.
You're doing these paintings and these ceramics.
I'm doing the paintings and the ceramics, although I think the ceramics was a nice time, but I don't think I'm going to pursue showing them anymore. I think I made a lot of things that I like having in my life, but I don't necessarily think of them in the same way as my painting.
Yeah, that is this kind of luxury state one can reach when making art and work that I felt when I was younger. Everything I made had to go into the pool of proving my worth or getting attention. There wasn't really like I'm going to make a ton of work and I'm going to show the world 5% of it. It was like, I'm going to show 100%.
Right.
And then I think as you get older, there is more of a parsing out. Like, I'm going to make this for myself. I'm going to make this for the public. I'm going to make this to sell. I suppose it'd be great to not compartmentalize, but I think it seems like it's a natural part of the process.
Yeah. I think the other thing too is like being younger, and I don't know if this is also kind of like aligned with the like rise of social media, it felt like there was this race to always be producing.
Yeah. There still is, but I don't really feel it anymore. And I don't know if that's just like you're old,
or if that's kind of it seems like that's becoming more of a consensus with people around social media, but maybe that's just people of my age too, where you don't need to show everyone everything you make. There can be some mystery. There can be some like growth. Because I feel like if you show someone something you made, then you stop considering it. And it's just like a thing that exists in the world now.
You get that serotonin hit. You're like,
you get the serotonin hit, but you don't really get to like have this nice time of like living with something and seeing how it feels to you. And then deciding like what it means. Or
you end its life.
Or you end its life, yeah. So, yeah. I think
we said it all, I think.
Yeah.
No, there's a lot. There's so much to be said, but it's all subterranean.
Yeah.
It's all hiding down there. All right.
Cool.
All right, be well. Have fun camping. Tell the boys I said hi.
Will do.
Peace.
All right. Bye.
Music by Dory Bavarsky and Mingja Chen. We'll see what happens next. Have a good week.